What man has done, man may do. This quotation speaks to the capacity of mankind to learn from each other. Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile, which is 1.6 kilometers, in 1954. People thought it was impossible back then when he did it. But after he did it, other athletes saw what he did and they said, hey, what this guy has done can be done. They appreciated that this was just a man, talented no doubt, but still just a man. Therefore, they set out to see what was possible with hard work and effort. As a result of that, the standard now is to be able to run the mile in under 4 minutes if you're a serious athlete. The world record for the 1,500 meters is actually 3 minutes 26 seconds. The world record for the mile is 3 minutes 43 seconds. I mean, they have shaved off seconds off that impossible feat over multiple years, because what man has done, man may do and man may exceed. But why is that not true for Africa? Why is it not true for Africa that what other countries have done, other countries can do? I mean, if you think about it, Nigeria is 60 years old. Kenya is 57 years old. Ghana is 63. Uganda is 58. The Democratic Republic of Congo is 60. Zimbabwe is 40 years old. By contrast, Singapore is 55. South Korea is 72. So why is it that we are not able to run the 4-minute mile of countries? Because we know that Singapore has been able to uplift its people from poverty and become global example of wealth building. We know that South Korea has been able to do the same. Why has Africa failed? I'm going to submit to you that while those reasons are important to understand, at some level they are academic. The obstacles and challenges of Africa have been documented in a variety of places and will still be documented. But broadly, if we were to summarize them, we would say that the following is true. African problems can be summarized into the following segments. Number 1, mismanagement. Mismanagement of projects, of institutions, of finances. Number 2, miseducation. The workforce has not been adequately trained for the epoch in which that workforce is supposed to live, compete, and exceed and succeed in. We have seen miseducation across the continent, which is why a large number of workers across Africa are still in the basic services sector. They're still cleaning, they're still gardening, they're still working in menial jobs because African leaders have failed to provide them with the quality of education, even though Africans themselves are talented. Misappropriation. There has been a looting project of Africa by African leaders and those connected with them for decades now. Miscoordination. There has been a lack of joint strategy in Africa to address the collective problems of Africa. These 4 problems, mismanagement, miseducation, misappropriation, miscoordination, have created the African condition, which is misery for the masses. I mean, consider this. The cost of illicit trade flows from Africa is $50 billion a year. $50 billion a year, just gone every year. And it happens in the form of tax evasion. It happens in the form of the transfer of state funds to offshore accounts. It happens in the form of trade mispricing. It happens in the form of money laundering. For every dollar of aid funding received, Africa loses $10 in illicit trade flows. The old men of this continent, who have an average age of 78, are leading this continent to failure and more failure and more failure. Their systems are exclusionary and dysfunctional. The old men have no urgency and no skills to deliver the Africa that we need, but they're in charge of the institutions. They have packed those institutions with the tools of inertia. Inertia can only recreate itself. I'm saying today that studying how Africa got here under black leadership is academic, Because even if we win and resolve the debate, which could take some time, nothing will have changed in the material world. Even if we get to the bottom of the Robert Mugabe legacy, nothing will have changed in the material world. What we need to recognize is that we cannot wait for these old men and we cannot wait for their institutions of inertia. We cannot wait to solve things anymore. I think what we must do is to spend more time and energy debating and organizing around the execution of strategic solutions outside of the framework of the old politics. If you're familiar with Newton's law of motion, the first law of motion says that an object will remain at rest or in uniform motion in a straight line unless compelled to change its state by the action of an external force. Which is to say, according to Newton, Africa will remain in the state unless acted upon by an external force. What is the external force? I would submit to you that it's us, the youth, the people who are outside of the institutions, the people who believe that Africa can be better and Africa should and must be better, the people who believe that unless Africa rises to its rightful place on the global scene, the global community is going to be at a disadvantage. Africa is a young continent led by old men. They have experience in violence and corruption. So while we must hold these institutions to account, we cannot strategically expect rapid reform from those institutions. We must now think outside of the system and outside of the regular order of things. We must really become the Joshua generation. This episode is the first episode where I'm going to start suggesting solutions to African problems, solutions that I think exist outside of the institutional order. Why? I think we need to think about this. We need to debate this because you can continue having debates. You can continue accumulating knowledge about Africa. But the point, as Karl Marx said, of all intellectual activity is not only to understand the world, but to change the world. We need to get to a point where we can begin to say to each other, I understand what you've said, but how do we fix the problem? And I think sometimes you can actually have a problem of over-analysis, a problem of analysis paralysis, as they would call it in business, where we continuously generate more and more piles of knowledge around why we are not winning, instead of generating piles and piles of strategy case studies of solutions that we have tried out in the real world to craft a strategy to win. We need to be a Joshua generation. Now, if you remember in the story of the Bible, and whether you believe in the Bible or not, is not really, I'm not here to sell the Bible to you, but there's a story in the Bible. Moses has been told to go to the promised land. He tries to get the people to the promised land, but they have to go through the desert. And while they're in the desert, there's two groups of people. There's the old generation, the one that lived under oppression. That old generation is in the desert, always complaining to Moses, always trying to worship new gods, always trying to generally derail the project. And then there's these young kids who grow up in the desert. They see the miracles, they see the works of God in the desert, and they have a winning attitude and a winning faith. So at some point they get to the border of the promised land. They're almost past the desert. So they send 12 spies into the promised land. The 12 spies go in there and they come back and they say, the promised land is amazing. They all agree on that. Then the question then becomes, can we take the promised land? 10 of the spies say, no, they're giants in that land. We looked like grasshoppers in their eyes. Joshua and Caleb say, promised land is amazing. We can take it. Let's go do it. And that is where Africa is right now. You have this old generation, these liberation movements, these people who have fought for Africa's freedom, but do not understand how to manifest Africa's success. And then you have this young generation, which is watching the world, which is seeing other peoples progress, which is seeing innovations come from everywhere else but Africa, which knows and wants to compete. Now, we need to be that Joshua generation. Our approach has been Can these elders help us? Please help me, Cyril Ramaphosa. Please do this, Emerson Mnangagwa. Please do this, Buhari. But I don't think that is what the youth need to be doing. I don't think that is what we need to be doing as new Pan-Africans, as neo-Pan-Africans. I think we need to be doing a different thing. And this episode is going to make suggestions around how to do that. These old people either don't see the potential or they're just not hungry enough to pursue African greatness. And many of them, to be honest, have been captured in various forms by those who benefit from a weak Africa. The multinationals that need cheap resources from Africa to take to China to make the commodities and the products that they make to resell to the world, they benefit from weak Africa. Whether it's in Nigeria, DRC, or Zimbabwe, they benefit from that because they need those resources at the cheapest bottom line. So they're not going to push for the improvement and development of Africa. That's why multinationals don't build schools here, because they don't benefit from a higher skill set from the African population, because that higher skill set population will start asking some tough questions. So those people who are in charge aren't always the right people for the progress that Africa needs. So multinationals and powerful governments, China, America, whatever the case may be, these governments have no motive in seeing Africa progress in the way that Africans would like to see it progress. So that's why you find that you can actually make the case that aid has underdeveloped Africa. That's why you can actually find that we see an Africa that has been destabilized by development loans, because the development loans are not really meant to develop as much as the paperwork may seem to suggest. So what I'm saying in saying all of this is to say, if we want to improve Africa, if we want to see a better Africa, we cannot rationally expect the old people to do it. They have no urgency, they have no vision, they don't have appetite for what young Africans would like to see Africa become. So that's not something that we ought to look to for our salvation. We ought to look to ourselves. So then the question becomes, what are the ideas that don't need politicians? So I'm gonna make a suggestion of 3 ideas today in this podcast. I want you to consider them, I want you to weigh them, and I want us to have an ongoing discussion, be it on social media, in person, or wherever. Or you can think about it, take it somewhere else. Have the discussion with other people as well. Idea number 1. Ideas that don't need politicians. 1. An African People's Union. An African People's Union, unlike the African Union, is not an institution where you have to go to Addis Ababa and become an ambassador or a president, etc. It's a forum where all Africans can organize and discuss the issues that they need. I think rationally, the African People's Union would have to have some kind of a membership fee so that it can raise funds. And the purpose of those funds will become apparent in the next idea. So I think it's important to have an African People's Union to discuss the issues that the old institutions do not want to discuss, to traverse the matters that the old leaders are afraid to discuss. Right? We have to have a continental forum which has integrity, which has transparency, and which has access. So rather than the African Union, which must continue to exist as an old institution, we need a people's institution, an African people's institution, the African People's Union. That's number 1. Number 2, an African investment fund. So aside from, you see, the whole thing is that Africa and the progress of Africa has been attached to these large institutions. They are supposed to be the institutions that help Africa get better, the large institutions. But I want to submit to you that that's not going to happen. What needs to happen is low entry institutions, not large ones, micro institutions. I want to explain what I mean by this, because the African Investment Fund must exist as a platform for micro investments across Africa for a variety of projects. So basically, anybody should be able to come in and say, I have 10 Rand, I have 1,000 Naira, I have so many shekels or whatever the currency may be, and I want to invest in this African project. I want to invest in this young man in Rwanda who's making these cool shoes that I value. Because in order for us to improve intra-Africa trade, we are waiting on the old men to sort out the African Continental Free Trade Area. Why do we have to wait for them? Why do we have to wait for them to get their act together, for them to deal with the egos that are happening at the continental level? I submit to you that we don't have to. We should create our own African investment fund to allow for micro investment across Africa for a variety of projects. Number 3, an African university fund. In the long term, the game that we are playing economically at the global level is one of high skills. Right now, software is eating the world. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, as well as new developments in mechanical engineering, where we're beginning to see robotics. We're beginning to see all of these things happening. And, 4IR is the term that people will use for a lot of the developments we're seeing in this particular world. In order to compete in that world, we are going to have to make sure that young Africans have the tools that they need. And those who want to relearn also have the tools that they need. This world that we're living in right now is going to require a lot of people to understand mathematics, to understand engineering, to understand computer science, to understand complex financial instruments as well. So we need to create a world where Africa can compete at that level. And what does that require? I'm going to submit to you that we are going to have to create a university fund. The reality is there are many brilliant young Africans across the continent who are genius level intelligent. They can do complex maths in their head. They can do a variety of things. What they lack is access to the institutions where that value can be captured into tangible ways. Growing up, if you've grown up in Africa, I'm sure in the townships, in the villages, you have encountered many brilliant people who just bumped into roadblocks along the way and could not exploit the full potential of their talents. Some people are sitting in Nigeria. Some people are sitting in Rwanda, in the DRC, with the brilliance, but they can't go to MIT to learn the skills that they need. So they end up just becoming maths teachers. They end up just becoming, less than what they could have been. But what if there was a fund funded by Africans, which could send these people to MIT, to Harvard, to wherever they need to go, Cambridge, Oxford, you name it. And with the condition, of course, that condition being either you come back to Africa and you get some money from our investment vehicles to create innovations in Africa. We will build labs for you. We will build warehouses for you, to factories for you to start experimenting. We will give you the equipment. Either you can do that, or because now you are a high-skilled individual wanted by the global community, or you can buy us out in a loan format or flat out buy us out. So if we spent $1 million to educate you at MIT, if you are not going to use that in Africa, then you must pay us 1.5 million or whatever the number is. So the idea is it can either be a loan if the person chooses to remain overseas, or it can actually be such that they come back and they develop. I think a lot of people, not all of them, but a lot of people will come back if we create an environment for them that is fertile. One thing about China that they did very well is that they sent kids overseas to America, to the United Kingdom, to learn at these top elite universities, but then created conducive environments for them to come back and create startups in China. They made it a possibility. So why are we not doing the same? We're waiting for these old guys to get around to doing it, but they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. So what are we going to do to make sure that the things that we have identified that need to happen actually happen? You may be thinking, these ideas seem improbable. These ideas seem unlikely. But the reality is, this is the reality. A lot of the disruptive ideas that have been happening in Silicon Valley are actually based on African principles. The African principles of Ubuntu, or if you will, Ujamaa. Ubuntu is a Nguni phrase. Ujamaa is the Swahili one. But basically, this is a value system that is consistent across Africa. A value system which states that the person is the person through the community. It expresses itself in crowd activities and crowdfunding. The Western model is historically individualistic, but the African model is historically collectivist. We have abandoned the African models in many ways and embraced a Western model, which doesn't really work for where we are in development. And we have to re-adopt our own model, which has been used by others to great effect. I'm going to give you 2 case studies which show how the Ubuntu model, the Ujamaa model, has been used to great effect. Kickstarter. Kickstarter was launched on 28 April 2019. It's a microfinancing and crowdfunding platform. To date, 19 million people have backed the project. 5.3 billion US dollars has been pledged, and 189,000 projects have been successfully funded. And Kickstarter is only run by a team of 92 people. Think about that. GoFundMe, founded in 2010, 9 billion US dollars raised from more than 120 million donations. Think about that. You have these 2 platforms which are using African principles to raise money and create successful projects in the real world. I don't know if you know this, but there is a massive ride-sharing company in America. It has 30% market share. This ride-sharing company is the product of Zimbabwe. I'll tell you what I'm talking about. In 2006, a gentleman called Logan D. Green traveled to Zimbabwe. And whilst he was there, he saw that African transport system. You know, in Zimbabwe, they call them combis. In South Africa, they call them taxis. In other parts of the world, in other parts of West Africa, they call them trotro. So this guy, American guy, comes to Zimbabwe, don't know what he was doing there, but he sees the transport system and he's like, wait a minute, this actually works. So what does he do? He goes back to America. He uses Facebook API. He starts organizing carpooling through Facebook, and he then develops an app. He calls the app Zimride, in short for Zimbabwe Ride. And this was in honor of the Zimbabwean carpooling network, right? This company then becomes Lyft. Lyft right now is currently valued at 30 billion US dollars. Think about that. An American comes to Zimbabwe, sees ride sharing, goes back to America, creates a company that eventually becomes worth 30 billion using African principles. So I think we need to do the same thing. And really embrace collective capitalism for Africa. So finding ways to come together as Africans to create the right kind of projects and products which we can take to the rest of the world to create value and to increase value in Africa so that we can begin to have the quality of life that we deserve. And that's not going to happen because of the politicians. It's going to happen as a result of us, not them, us. So the 3 ideas again. 1, an African People's Union, a purpose of which is to organize Africans. Number 2, an African Investment Fund, the purpose of which is to create a platform for micro investments across Africa for a variety of projects. And number 3, an African University Fund. We really have the capacity to do this. Let me tell you an interesting statistic. Sub-Saharan Africa sees a lot of remittance flows from Europe, from America, from the African diaspora. In fact, I'm going to give you the numbers. In 2020, it's going to be 37 billion. In 2019, it was 48 billion. The reason why there's been a drop, obviously, is COVID-19. But there's going to be a world after COVID. But if you think about it, 37 billion is still a lot of money. Many countries in Africa rely heavily on the diaspora remittances. The challenge, however, with remittances is that they've often been used just for family, for food, for upkeep. There's not been a targeted drive at using remittances to create wealth from Africa to the world, to use them to fund Ubuntu Ujamaa, to create this collective capitalism. The reality is remittances show the potential. 1.3 billion people across Africa, 50 billion almost last year in remittances. Way more money than Africa is getting in aid. Way more money than Africa is getting in aid. Way more money than is funding the African Union and some of its projects. So if you think about the 1.3 billion, if you think about the 50 billion in remittances, if you also think about the African diaspora community, the African descendants of slaves who are residing in different places, be it America, UK, Jamaica, etc. A lot of these people have been trying to create wealth in environments with high barriers of entry. If you're trying to develop property in the United Kingdom, in America, the price of property is prohibitive. The return on your investment is going to be very low because of the nature of the environment. But in Africa, you can get 10x, 100x returns. But we have not been selling Africa as an investment destination to the African descendants of slaves. The reality is nobody is going to make a lot of money and wealth in America if the system is not designed to favor that. The amount of dollars that people who live in the projects, people who live in underprivileged communities in America, those dollars are not going to go very far in America. So we need to start saying to them and creating platforms for them to invest in Africa. Collective capitalism. If someone could come to Africa, see an idea and use it to make billions for themselves, why can we not take our own idea and use it to make billions for ourselves? This is why I'm saying we need to take a different direction. We need to start debating solutions. Now, these solutions, these three suggestions, right now, they need a lot of buy-in. They need a lot of collective work. Right? Because how do you even start creating an African People's Union? How do you start creating an African investment fund, an African university fund? Those are questions for later. I'm putting out ideas so that you can consider them, so that you can start to think, okay, why? Why not? How can we do this? How can we make it a reality? The reality is, as I've been doing this Africa analysis work, I've been a little bit frustrated because, you can get really stuck in the anger, the frustration, looking at how can all of these old people mess something up so badly. But then you have to start thinking proactively, start thinking like a champion, start thinking like a winner. And that thought process is, how do we win? How do we create the capacity for success in Africa? And that's what this podcast episode was about. So it's a different kind of podcast episode. I'm really trying to make this valuable to you as a listener, to provoke your thought, to provoke your thinking on the topic. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. But I'm curious to hear, what do you think? What are your thoughts? How can we fix Africa outside of African politicians and these African institutions which are not working for us? That has got to be our thought process. That has got to be our agenda. And I think I want this podcast to be part and parcel of that community, the community of people who are looking for solutions. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your support. This has been an episode of Josie to Lagos.